Good morning. If you're visiting with us this morning, we're really happy to have you here. We're honored by your presence, and we hope that you stick around a little bit afterwards, give us a chance to get to know you. It's good to have a nice sunny day today, cooler weather today than yesterday. Tornado season started a little bit early for us this year, but as Kevin pointed out, the Lord was gracious to us in this area. Others west of us and north of us were not so lucky, and we pray for their recovery, and our hearts are with those families who lost loved ones in the storms yesterday. I hope that you will be back this evening at 5 o'clock. We will have our area-wide youth devotional. We get to host that this month, and we're really fortunate to have that opportunity. And I'm excited to be here and to be able to fellowship with the young people all around the city. Some people get a little confused about area-wide youth devotional at Ashville Road. What is that? That's going to be our worship service at 5. As usual, we're just going to have a lot of young guests with us. And a lot of churches, when they have these kinds of things, will separate the youth off from the rest of the congregation. I'm proud that we have everybody in here together for that. I think it's really important for all the generations to worship together, and for those of us who are older to get to know these young people. I'm looking forward to that service. Ron Hill and Hunter Kinnemer will be leading our worship this evening for that, so hope that you can be back for that opportunity. The title for this morning's lesson is, Can the World Hear Us Snoring? The world does hear us snoring. Now, the world doesn't necessarily pay attention to other things. Maybe you feel that your actions often go unnoticed. I know that's true, and it can be very frustrating when you do good things and nobody notices and you don't get any credit for it. In fact, sometimes it can go to the other extreme. Maybe you've heard the saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Sometimes your kindness backfires, so a lot of times nobody's paying attention to your actions. And it's often the case that people don't pay attention to your words either. Nobody likes to be ignored. Don't you hate that when you're trying to tell somebody something, trying to get somebody's attention, and they're ignoring you? It's really frustrating to have that. And sometimes it just feels like nobody's listening. I think it's kind of humorous. Sometimes somebody will give me a sermon topic. Here's a sermon idea. You might want to preach on this sometime. And then they'll tell me a topic of something that I preached like 2 weeks before that. But a preacher can't expect people to always be listening to every sermon, so you kind of let that go. But it can be frustrating sometimes to feel like people aren't listening to your words. And sometimes your deeds aren't noticed, your words aren't noticed. But people always notice when you're snoring. Ever been sitting in church right in front of somebody who got really comfortable and really warm, and you kind of hear them relaxing, and then you start hearing them sawing logs behind you? It's happened before. Most people can relate to that. And there's never been a service in which somebody was snoring and nobody noticed. I can guarantee you that. When you're standing up here, you can see everything. And if somebody falls asleep and they're snoring, people aren't looking up here. They're trying to find out who it is that's snoring. So can people hear you when you're snoring? The answer is a resounding yes. But the other question is, why am I asking this question this morning on a Sunday morning? Can the world hear us snoring? And it has to do with Jonah, as you may have guessed from our text this morning, Jonah chapter 1. See, Jonah was given a command from the Lord to go to the city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and preach against their wickedness in hopes that they may repent. But Jonah did not go to Nineveh. Instead, he went down to Joppa, found a ship headed for Tarshish, which was as far in his imagination as he could go in the opposite direction from where the Lord commanded him to go. And because of his reluctance and his disobedience, the Lord sent a storm that struck the ship Jonah and his shipmates were on And as the mariners were hurling cargo overboard and fighting for their lives, Jonah had gone down into the hull of the ship and had lain down and had fallen asleep. And the captain shook him. In verse 6 has the captain say to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." That's why we're talking about snoring this morning. Because some have gone down to the bottom of the ship and they've fallen asleep. And we need to think about that and ask the question, does the world notice that we've fallen asleep the way that captain had noticed Jonah, the prophet of God, had fallen asleep? But before we get to Jonah's snoring, I want to talk about the actions of two others in this story that also might be instructive to us as well. And so let's start with the Lord first of all, and notice that the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. The language in the text, Jonah chapter 1, is very interesting. It says just that the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. And the word translated hurled there is a very interesting word. It has to do with a mighty cast or a great throw, like he threw the storm upon the sea to hit the spot where Jonah and his shipmates were in that ship, so that it would strike them. It was a purposeful action that the Lord took. It's the same word that is used in other places in this chapter. In verse 5, the very next verse, we read that the mariners hurled the cargo out onto the sea. And later in verse 12, Jonah would suggest that they hurl him into the sea. And that's what they do in verse 15. Every time that verb is used in those verses, it's the same one here to describe God throwing this storm out upon these men who are in danger. It's the same word used in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 11 to describe how King Saul hurled a spear to try to pin David against the wall to kill him. And so it's an action of strength, of purpose, of great wrath. And God is taking it upon Jonah and, of course, the others who are with him in this ship. So the language shows that. And in order to dramatically explain this, describe this even more, it also personifies the ship. My translation says that the ship threatened to break up. But more literally, the ship is the one who is thinking that it's going to be torn into pieces. One translation says, the ship thought she'd be broken to pieces, speaking as if the ship itself was afraid. Of course, this is just a poetic description of the situation. It's all language designed to paint a picture here of a situation that's very precarious for Jonah and the sailors. It's to show how intense this storm really was and how angry God was with Jonah, who was shirking his responsibility. The Lord hurled a great storm upon the sea. It's obvious that the Lord had brought this storm upon Jonah and the sailors because of Jonah's reluctance, because of his disobedience. The Lord was in control here. And this is not the last place in the text where the Lord will orchestrate events and control things in order to bring about His will. In fact, I want to share some other examples with you that are very interesting in the book of Jonah. This short little book has the Lord active in so many interesting ways. For example, in chapter 1, verse 17, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. People ask, well, was that a whale or was that some kind of a giant shark or sea creature? We don't know what it was. My idea, because of the language used here, is that it was some kind of special creature, a one-of-a-kind creature made to swallow Jonah up and keep him alive for God's purposes. God appointed that. He made that happen. And then in chapter 2, verse 10, you have this same language used again. The Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. And so again, God is interacting And he's speaking to this fish that he appointed for swallowing Jonah up. And then in chapter 4, you have this in succeeding verses 6, 7, and 8, this kind of action again. The Lord, verse 6, appointed a plant, made it come up over Jonah that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. Verse 7, when the dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm so that it attacked the plant and it withered. And then verse 8, when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint, and he asked that he might die, and he said, "It is better for me to die than to live." In every case, appointing the fish, making the fish to vomit Jonah up on the dry land, appointing the plant, the gourd, the scorching east wind, the worm, God is involved here. He is acting for the purposes of His own will. And I think that's important for us to know. When the storms of life blow and beat against us, do not give in to the temptation of thinking that God is powerless or impotent to act on our behalf. Or worse yet, that He's not even there. God is involved. He is able to do these things and so much more. He is able to come and help us on our behalf. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 9 says, "The Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials." And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13, we read that no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation will also provide a way to escape that you may be able to endure it. And 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 12 says, "The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and His ear is open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." God is listening, and He is able to act, and He will interact when it serves the purposes of His will and when it does what is best for us. So we see the Lord, first of all, in action here. He hurls a storm upon the sea. Well, let's turn to the mariners next. And we notice they're acting as well. What are they doing? When we look, we see these pagan sailors on the ship with Jonah crying out to their gods. They're afraid. And verse 5 says, they're afraid, and each cried out to his God. You notice that each one is crying out to a different God. There may be as many gods on that ship as there are sailors. They may all be saying different prayers to different deities that they've created in the imagination of their minds. They're not praying to the true and living God, but they're praying. They're crying out. What do you do when you're in trouble like this? There are a lot of people who in the good times don't pray to God. But what do you do when the storms of life strike? To whom do you cry out? When you don't have a God, when you don't worship anything or anyone, when you're not a religious person, what do you do when the storms strike? There are a lot of so-called atheists who cry out to someone or something when they're in trouble. But they haven't taken the time to investigate and learn whether there's someone out there and what's his name and who is he and what is his nature and is he listening? But we know who to cry out to. We know who to pray to, and we know that He is there. When the storms of life strike, to whom do you cry? When a tragic accident affects your life, to whom do you cry? When you lose your job and you don't know what you're going to do next and you don't know how you're going to put food on the table, who do you cry out to? To whom do you turn? When you're diagnosed with a chronic illness and the treatments are going to be hard and you don't know what's coming next and you don't know what the future holds, to whom do you cry? When you lose a loved one to death, who's out there? What do you do? To whom do you pray? When the sailors cried out to their gods, The only response they received was the roar of the heartless wind and the continuing upheaval of the waves. But when we cry out to God, He hears us. He's listening. Now, I know sometimes people think, even when they believe in the true and living God, they're getting the same results these sailors are getting in the book of Jonah, because they don't get an immediate answer, or they don't get the answer they expect to receive, the answer that they want. And that's when we need to be reminded that the Lord answers prayer in a number of ways. But He's always listening when His children cry out to Him. Now, sometimes He may say no, because we're asking something that's not according to His revealed will in Scripture. Maybe it's not according to His providential will. We don't know what's best for us sometimes. And so sometimes He says no. Sometimes He answers with a yes. And I think we're far too quick to forget those times. I think a good exercise this year in 2020 would be to keep a prayer journal and to keep track of all the prayers that God answers yes to, because there's far more than we give Him credit for. Believe me, far more than we give Him credit for. Sometimes He says not yet, or not now, or just wait, or be patient, because the timing isn't right. And all things happen according to God's timing, not our own. And then sometimes He answers our prayer not by giving us what we asked for, but giving us something that's far better, beyond our ability to imagine. Have you ever thought about that? So I know that it's tempting to feel the way these sailors felt on that storm-tossed sea as they cried out to their deaf gods that really didn't exist. They came to a realization that all of those cries and all of those words were meaningless because they were targeted at something that didn't exist. And I know that sometimes you may be tempted to think the same thing, but it's different in our case. Our God listens and He hears. He may not answer in the manner we expect Him to, but He's there. John said, "This is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, we know that we have the request that we have asked of Him." 1 John chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Now, what did these sailors do when they cried out to God, to their gods, and they didn't hear an answer? They took more drastic measures. Verse 5 tells us they began to hurl the cargo into the sea. The word for cargo there refers to something made or something completed or something prepared. These were special things they were throwing into the sea. They were regarded as extremely important when they left port. They may have been the items of merchandise they were transporting for commerce. They might have been food provisions. They might have been clothing or other things they needed for the long journey. But at this point, those things didn't matter anymore. They didn't care about them. Garbage compared to their own lives. They were jettisoning things that just hours ago they believed were extremely important. That's what happens when storms strike. You throw out everything except the most important thing. And you know what that means? That means you better figure out what the most important thing is. Because the storms are going to hit, and you need to know what you can throw out and what you need to keep. And if you've got the first thing, if the first thing in your life is the wrong thing, you're going to be in trouble, because you're going to be throwing out everything else. What if you make yourself number one? What happens? When things get hard, you turn inward, you become selfish, you think only about yourself, you start throwing everybody else away, you start throwing everything else away, you start throwing out everybody else's ideas and everybody's help until you're alone. And that's no good. That doesn't help. What if you make money, wealth, possessions, material things the number one thing in your life? How does that help when you're faced with questions of life and death? How does that help when you're faced with the biggest questions that are rattling around in our minds. What good does that do when times get hard? You start throwing everything else out, and all you have is something you can't take with you to the next place. But if God is your number one thing, not only is He enough, but He's going to help you know what you can jettison and what you can hang on to. He's going to give you the wisdom to know what's unessential, unnecessary, and what you need to hang on to, and He will not allow you to throw out those things that you truly need. You stay focused on God, and you can complete the race. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God." Now, what's really interesting is the same poor, ignorant sailors who cried out to their deaf gods were the first ones in this story to suggest crying out to the God. Look at the words of the captain in verse 6. He changes from gods in the plural, and he uses the definite article, and he says to Jonah, "Call out to your God, perhaps the God will give a thought to us." And by the end of this episode in the life of Jonah, the captain and the rest of the sailors are talking about the Lord using His name, Yahweh, Jehovah, saying to Jonah and saying to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life." They were the first ones, not Jonah, to suggest the God is in control, and He's the one we need to cry out to, and He's the one to turn to when the storms of life strike. And so while the Lord was hurling a storm against this ship in the sea, the sailors were hurling their cargo overboard and were crying out to their gods. And what was Jonah doing? Let's look at Jonah. Jonah snored. Jonah was asleep in the bottom of the ship. Jonah is on a descent to a dark place. Over and over again, the text tells us that Jonah is going down. Did you catch that? Look at verse 3 of Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1. Look at verse 3. Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord, and he went down to Joppa. And then look again at verse 5. Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. Then in chapter 2, after he'd been swallowed by the fish, he's praying to the Lord, and he confesses in verse 6, "I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever." He's going down, 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 deeper and deeper into the abyss. He's headed in the wrong direction. Now, why was he asleep? Well, there are a number of theories. We don't know for sure. He could have been exhausted. No doubt he'd been traveling and skipping meals and skipping sleep. And so he'd finally gotten a chance to be still. He thought he was hidden. Maybe he was just completely exhausted. Could be that he was spent from carrying the burden of his sin. I'm going to tell you something. Sin is exhausting. And what's more exhausting than open sin is trying to hide in sin and refusing to confess your wrongs. The psalmist writes about that in Psalm 32. David knew how exhausting unconfessed sin could be. He wrote this in verses 3 and 4. "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer." Maybe Jonah was just weighed down with the burden of his sins. Maybe he was just depressed and afraid and anxious. Have you ever been like that? You ever been so depressed that the only thing you want to do is just go to bed, close your eyes to the world, and sleep? That's a very common reaction, natural thing to do. The problem with it is you're going to wake up, and your problems are still going to be there when you wake up. And so Jonah, he could go down in the bottom of that ship. He could fall asleep. He can only sleep so long. When he wakes up, Jonah, where are you going to be then? Still running away from the presence of the Lord, when the people of Nineveh still need the message of God, and Israel still needs their prophet to be doing what he was commissioned to do. He was running away from a responsibility he just couldn't run from. Why was he sleeping? We don't know for sure. We just know that his sleeping, his snoring, attracted the attention of the people around him. Remember what we said at the opening of the lesson. People may ignore your deeds, they may ignore your words, but they will not ignore your snoring. They're going to hear you snoring. And this captain heard Jonah and went down to the bottom of the ship. And he said, "What do you mean, O sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." And the question before us this morning is, does the world hear the church when it sleeps to its commitment and responsibility to God? Can the world hear us snoring? What opportunities are there around us today that we're ignoring? Are there friends and neighbors around us that need our help? Are there people that suffered from the storms yesterday that need a helping hand, maybe a little food, maybe a little assistance of some kind? Maybe we could share our wealth with others. Are there opportunities that we're turning a blind eye to, that we're sleeping to? Am I doing what I can to encourage those who are having a very difficult time right now? Am I writing them a card or making a phone call or a visit, seeing what I can do, maybe preparing a meal for them? Am I trying to stay tuned in to the needs of the people in this congregation? Am I going to my care group meetings, learning about who's sick, who's in need, who's grieving right now, who's suffering and hurting? Am I doing what I can to increase the attendance at Bible school and at worship here in the church services? Am I telling other people about the Ashville Road Church of Christ and what's going on here? Am I inviting them to come to services and to be a part of the worship here and to learn more about God? Am I looking for opportunities to have conversations with the lost about the gospel, about the hope that's in Jesus? Do I care enough about their souls to say a word to them? Speak a kind word of encouragement. There are great needs in the world that can be met by the church. Look, folks, I don't have to tell you, the culture's going crazy. The world's going crazy. It's full of hatred, spite, selfishness, pride, immorality, immodesty, vulgarity. It's everywhere around us. And the world needs us right now. The world needs the influence of the church for good. If we're not here, what's going to happen? So many of us are sleeping. And the world's pushing us and prodding us and saying, "Why are you sleeping? Why won't you get up and help us? Why won't you do something?" Who's poking at you? Who has noticed that you call yourself a Christian, but you're asleep to the responsibilities you have in the world? Who's your captain? Who's playing the captain to your Jonah? Who's trying to get your attention? Is there somebody out there that's saying, "Arise and get up and call out"? You know what's interesting about that captain's words recorded in Jonah chapter 1 verse 6? He says, "Arise and call out." Look at the beginning of the book of Jonah, chapter 1, and the words of the Lord as recorded in verse 2. What does he say to Jonah? He says, "Arise." go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. Do you think that's a coincidence? Maybe. Maybe it is. I think it's very interesting. The words of that captain echo the words of the Lord. You've got a prophet asleep in the bottom of a boat and a pagan captain who's never heard the word Jehovah in his life. And who sounds more like God? The captain, not Jonah. Centuries later, another would sleep in the hold of a ship. But this time, the reason for his slumber would be very different than Jonah's. In Mark chapter 4, verse 35, Jesus and his disciples are on a ship on the Sea of Galilee. Different sea, different time. But a similar thing happens out of nowhere. This huge gale, you might say, was hurled upon the ship on the sea. And the ship was being tossed about and it was filling up with water. And Jesus was in the stern of the ship, asleep. And it got their attention. They went down and they shook him like that captain shook Jonah. And they said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Jonah, arise, get up, call out to your God. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Something very different happened with the Lord. He rose up. He rebuked the wind and the seas. "Peace, be still," and all got calm. And then he looked at those disciples and he said, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Here's the difference. Jonah slept because of the burdens of sin upon him, because he was afraid, because he was depressed, because he was anxious, because he had lost hope. And Jesus was sleeping because he had faith. Jesus was not afraid. He slept because he knew he had the peace of God. And he knew what was going to happen. And he wasn't afraid. And the world heard his sleeping too. But it was a completely different reaction. Does the world hear us snoring? And why are we asleep? The Lord described the church as salt and light in the Sermon on the Mount. And He said this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under other people's feet." And then He said, "You are the light of the world. City set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp, put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Now I ask you this question. If we're the salt and we're the light, but we're asleep, what hope does this world have? It's time for us to wake up. It's up to us to do something. Why do you sleep? Why not wake up? Do you need to wake up this morning? Do something. Change your ways. Awaken to your responsibilities and your commitments in the Lord. Start living the way God wants you to live. You need to obey the gospel and become a Christian. Commit your life to Him, knowing the best life is in Jesus, the most abundant life. Is it time to make a change and rededicate your life to Him and serve Him faithfully so that you can one day inherit that home prepared for those who love God? If we can help you in any way, we ask you to come, to wake up and come now as we stand and as we sing.